Welcome to the Talking, Learning and Teaching podcast. Joining us today, we have one of the most influential voices in learning and teaching in higher education in the UK. He's the author of The Lecturer's Toolkit and Making Learning Happen. And I'm really pleased to say I'm joined by Phil Race today on the podcast. Phil, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thanks ever so much for joining us. I want to talk to you today about your ripples on a pond model of how people learn. And I want to talk to you about that because it's been a really influential model in my own career as a teacher, but also in the subsequent careers of all the teachers that I've supported as an educational developer, because it's one that I've often foisted upon them and said, you must have a look at this because it's really good and it really explains a lot about how people really learn. So the first question really is, at the heart of ripples on a pond is the want and the need to learn. So to what extent do we as teachers in higher education need to motivate our learners to learn? I mean, surely as adults, they should be self-motivated, shouldn't they?
I think we need to do everything we can to try to motivate them, but we can't always win. With a group of learners, whether online or face-to-face, there's going to be one or two that are really switched on and are dead keen on what we're doing. But there's always going to be a few that are there because they had to, they're there because they're thinking of something entirely different and this sort of thing. We can't motivate them all, but we can try our best to capture them. And it goes back to the ways of getting a group of learners motivated. In a way, if they like it, if they really like it, they're probably already fairly ready for whatever. If we've done something to really offend them and we were rude to them last time or something, they'll still remember that and they'll be looking critically at what we do. Also, if the subject is relevant to what they're doing, they're likely to be motivated. But if they know too much about it, they could be demotivated because we're telling them things they already know and nobody likes that too much. So you can't win them all, I think is the short answer to that question.
So how important then is it that we know what motivates our learners, and should we make an effort to find out as teachers?
Absolutely. I think the more we can do to find out what's in their minds, the better. Now, I am fairly accomplished at using Postit notes, as you probably remember. I've used them all my life pretty well, since they're invented. And one thing I always used to do with learners is issue Postit and say, jot down your own answer to the following question. Things would be much better if only I. Now, the things could be the subject, it could be all sorts of things. But I wanted to get there if only. And I used to very often ask them now, swap Post-its and read out somebody else's. So they've got the comfort of anonymity, but somebody's writing there, somebody from the group. And do a flavour of those and find out what the group are thinking as a whole, what's bothering them, what's motivating them, and that sort of thing. But then I'd always get them to stick the Post-it on a flip chart close to me. And every now and then I'd have a look at the written answers as well. And of course, you get all sorts of things on that. You get things that are quite relevant, you get things that aren't relevant, doesn't matter. You're finding out what their if-onlys are. And the more you can refer to the if-onlys in the subsequent session, the more they will feel that they're being taken notice of. And I think that increases the motivation. So doing what we can to find out what's on their mind is good. Another way of doing it is, if we've worked with a group before, to put a slide up saying 3 or 4 possible things that they might have on their mind, and ask for a show of hands. How many of you are thinking this? How many of you are thinking that? And then you can start with the most popular one, the most controversial one or whatever. And again, they feel they're being taken notice of. The more they feel we're on their side, the better.
I think it's really important what you mentioned there, Phil, about taking notice of the learners and trying to get a handle on what they're thinking as being really important. And you mentioned there, obviously, the power of Post-it notes as a tool to be able to do that. I mean, I think I said to you, didn't I, before we started recording this, that I don't think I'd ever taught anything with Post-it notes before I was lucky enough to be part of one of your sessions, and I think ever since that day, they've been probably one of the most effective tools that I've ever used in the classroom.
You can do it online with Padlet as well. You know, it's got its spin-offs.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to turn our attention now to the learning by doing aspects of Ripples on a Pond. So, why is learning by doing such a powerful approach to learning effectively?
Well, workshops both with learners and with staff. I have a series of 6 questions I tend to ask them, I've developed over the years. And the first one, which I've asked for many, many years now, is think of something you're dead good at. Anything at all in your life. It doesn't matter what it is. On a Post-it, write down how you became good at it. And there's another one, and I usually get those up on a chart. But I always, again, get them to swap and read out somebody else's so I don't feel embarrassed. But by far the most common word is practice. They become good at doing something by practicing it, by doing it, just by getting on with it and that sort of thing. And it's how we all learn, actually. You know, you can learn so much from a book, but it's when you try it out, it really starts to become part of one's accomplishments, as it were. You know, the more we can feel that we're getting in charge of what they are doing, how they naturally learn, and the more they feel that this is a natural way of learning, learning by doing is perfectly natural, there's nothing remarkable about it, the more they'll trust us.
So I think that's a really important point, because, you know, you don't become an expert baker by reading books about baking, do you really? You have to do some baking in order to gain that expertise.
And the rider, of course, is doing and practice are the most common things, but one of the very common things is trial and error. And, you know, trial and error is absolutely permissible. You know, we want people to make the mistakes that they're going to make. We all want to make mistakes we're going to make. That's how we learn everything, in fact, by getting it wrong and then not getting it wrong next time and that sort of thing. And again, the people that are frightened of making a mistake, they feel comforted by the fact it's a legitimate way of learning. It's how everybody does it.
So even when we're lecturing, should we still get them to learn by doing? And any tips on how we do that?
Absolutely. My way of getting them to do things was usually Postit. I pop a question on the screen, get them to write down their answers, get them either to say their own answer or to say somebody else's answer and this sort of thing. But give them, rather than tell them something, ask them what they think it could be. And, you know, in normal subject things, what do you think the cause of such and such might be? What might be the factor that influences so-and-so? And a lot of them will think of the right factors. And you can often list the factors of things that are going on. And again, you see, it's then their knowledge that you're using rather than giving them something they might already have or might not already have. And I think we shouldn't talk for more than 5 minutes without giving them something to do, a decision to make. Something, not just do you think so-and-so, but which of the following would be better? What's wrong with this one? And why wouldn't it work? And the more we can get them to feel ownership of what's going on, the more they feel happy, in fact.
I think that's a really good tip there. So, you know, don't speak for any longer than 5 minutes without giving the students something to do or something to think about, I think is a really, really good pointer that anybody listening to this could take forward and use in their own practice.
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to the Post-it notes again that you mentioned, I mean, whenever I've been in a lecturing scenario, I've always been armed with copious amounts of Post-it notes, because they really do come in handy, even from working on a traffic light basis. If people kind of have clear understanding of certain concepts, they can kind of hold up a green Post-it, or if they're unsure or have a question, it can be amber. And if they really don't know what I'm talking about, it can be a red Post-it note or something like that. So,
and how many of you got your heads around the idea of such and such, and then green, amber, and the red is a very good way of showing it. You know, and it's useful to have something with these colours on. One colleague of mine used to have a module handbook that had those colours bound in, and hold up your handbook at the right page.
Yeah.
If they're all holding up amber, it means say it another way, introduce it another way. If they're holding up red, have a real good go at starting from scratch again. If it's green, you can not say it anymore because you're not going to be boring them by saying it anymore. You can get the measure. I think, though, also impromptu tasks are good. If somebody asks you a question and it's a dead good question, turn it around and say, what do you all think? Which is it, this, that, or the other, and get them to think what it is. And ask the person who asked the question, does that satisfy you? Or would you argue with this? And this sort of thing. Get the dialogue going.
I think, the benefit of all of that you just mentioned is, even when, we are checking learner understanding, we can make that active, can't we? We can use the Post-it notes. You can turn the questions back on the other students, as you mentioned there, to get their views. So there are obviously always multiple opportunities, aren't there, within the lecturing environment to make things active and learn by doing. I want to turn our attention now, Phil, to feedback. So we all know how important it is to receive feedback if we want to learn anything effectively, but how important is it to give feedback in terms of learning? I mean, will giving feedback help learners learn?
It can help, but it's not all that good because the feedback mightn't be received. The feedback might be ignored. It might have a hostile reception. It might, part of it will be taken notice of and part of it just filed away. A lot of the feedback that we write is never read, which is very sad in a way because we've often thought quite hard before we wrote it and this sort of thing. Face-to-face feedback is a lot better than written feedback. Face-to-face feedback to a group is really good because you can say something that you know is somebody's problem without looking at the person whose problem it is, so that they don't feel embarrassed and this sort of thing. And what you've got face-to-face, you've got the tone of voice, you've got the gesture, you've got the smile, you've got the encouragement. You have nothing like that in writing. One exercise I used to use on feedback was I would get everyone on a single sheet of paper to write down some feedback to someone who had just failed something, someone who had not succeeded, basically, as kindly as you can, nicely, calmly, politely, and all that sort of thing. I would then get them to swap pieces of paper and to read out the one that they now had in a sarcastic, ironic, threatening manner. And it's amazing how the kindest intention can be completely turned around by it being come across sarcastically. And I remind people that the learner might be in a bad mood when they read the feedback. They might, the cat might have been sick on the mat. There's all sorts of things that might have happened. And this is a bad day to get the feedback. And if it's at all critical, they will just think they'll read it in the worst possible way. And with tone of voice, your smile can completely disarm a comment. It can make it non-threatening. So face-to-face feedback, I think, is a lot better than written feedback. I would almost consider banning written feedback being anything that's regarded seriously because it works so badly. You can have visual feedback a bit better on maybe a questionnaire where it's fully met, partly met, not yet met. You can get a bit more attention that way, and it's less threatening that way. But you still got to be careful with feedback, especially not feedback in red ink. Feedback in red is really, for those that aren't colorblind, it's one thing we shouldn't do. So feedback in pencil or feedback in green if you're going to write at all. And of course, my handwriting is terrible, so feedback in my handwriting tends to be pretty bad, but if it's better typed, but it's still better spoken. And audio feedback is so much better than just written feedback, on a podcast or something like that.
I mean, it sounds there, Phil, like there's a real personalization element to feedback in terms of making it more effective, because obviously written words can sometimes feel a little bit impersonal, and like you say, if it's read out in a sarcastic manner or whatever, then the student can take it very differently. What would your top tips on getting learners to engage with feedback be? I mean, you obviously talked about spoken feedback rather than written. Are there any other top tips that you would have on engaging with feedback?
Well, feedback should be a dialogue anyway. That's why it's so much better face to face. If you see David Winston's and David Carlos's latest book, it's about dialogic feedback, and you've got no guarantee it's working unless it's a two-way thing, unless you've had feedback on what has been received and what's going to happen next and that sort of thing. So feedback should involve the voice rather than just the eyes, I would say. Now, one way of doing this with learners is to get them looking at each other's feedback. When you've put feedback on their work, get them to look at 2 or 3 others and see what attracted praise, what attracted criticism. And the things that attracted praise in somebody else's work are actually taking quite a lot of notice of. The people think, well, I could have done that. I thought that I could have got that. I could have got that praise. And the things that attracted criticism, even better, because they think, well, I didn't do that. At least I'm better than that, And that's one of the things that could have gone wrong. And I think people will learn more from feedback given to other people, written feedback given to other people, than they'll ever learn from written feedback given to themselves. And they put the feedback given to themselves as part of a picture, as part of a continuum. So I would really get them to look at each other's marked work and share the feedback. Ideally with people that they know and trust, so they don't feel embarrassed doing that. But even randomly, it still works.
I think that's a fantastic idea to get learners to look at each other's feedback. It almost depersonalizes it, doesn't it? So that you can actually clearly see the pointers and the learning to take from it. I want to switch now from feedback to assessment. So obviously, assessment is a huge topic in education, a huge can of worms. I mean, how important is it to assess learning or evaluate learning on a session by session basis? So to check learning outcomes have been met, for example?
I think it's absolutely crucially important, because the thing that's going to count for learners at the end of the day is going to be some sort of assessment, to get a mark or a grade or whatever. And they're well aware of it. And they need to know how it works. They need to know how it happens. Now, session by session, one thing we can do is to go through the learning outcomes in the last 5 minutes or so of the session, online or in face-to-face. Put the learning outcomes up one by one and ask for some sort of indication from them as to whether they feel fully satisfied with it or partly satisfied with it or not yet. And if you do this at the end of a live session, you can notice the ones where people have still got worries about it, and you can respond to those quite deliberately in the next session as part of the agenda. And of course, the learning outcomes mightn't be understandable to them at the start of the session. They should be more understandable by the end when they know what we mean by it. But it's quite good to actually get them to be thinking of what the learning outcomes mean to them. And one thing I've often done with students is ask them to rewrite the learning outcomes in a better way. What do you think it means? And I say, if your way is a lot better than mine, we'll use your way next time, and that's how things evolve. Because words in learning outcomes can be a sort of jargon thing that students don't know about. So the more we can get them to practice judging themselves, judging how they're getting on all the way through a session, the better. And one thing I used to do with my own students way back, I'd have the learning outcomes on each of the sessions, as a template, and they knew them all. And I would, every now and then, I'd say, if you can do all of these learning outcomes, you can achieve all of these outcomes, there's nothing at all I can ask you that will cause you any bother. You'll automatically do well in the exam. The learning outcomes are the framework that you're going to be assessed against. If it's not in the learning outcomes, I won't ask you about it. And of course, we've then got to make sure that if it's important, it is in the learning. But I think it's very important that they recognize the learning outcomes as their territory, what they're going to try to achieve. And add to them as the sessions unfold. There's often another one comes to the fore that's an essential outcome. And sometimes there's something that isn't an outcome, that isn't important at all. And it's worth saying, this is just for information at the moment. You're not going to be tested on this. You never need to know this, but it'll help you think about the thing that comes to the thing that follows, as it were. So using learning outcomes in that way can really, really help.
I think that's a great tip, actually, to ask the students the extent to which they understand the learning outcomes, because I think we often enter into teaching scenarios with a lot of assumptions, don't we, that the students do understand it as clearly as we do, whereas I think frequently they probably don't. And unless you check in, you're probably doing them a little bit of a disservice in that regard, aren't you?
Well, one thing, I try not to use the word understand. I've avoided that for years now because nobody knows whether they understand something or not. You can find out to what extent somebody understands something by the assessment they do and this sort of thing. But they don't know whether they understand it. I remember as a student, I learned thermodynamics. I didn't particularly enjoy thermodynamics. It's not the most serious subject, but I thought I understood it all. And I didn't worry about it. I passed the exams in it and this sort of thing. When I started teaching it a few years later, I found I hadn't understood it at all. I understood it an awful lot better now that I taught it, now that I explained it. And so I don't know whether I understand something because I might understand it a lot better tomorrow. And I think understanding is too vague a word. It's what are you required to do, or what do you need to do to show that you've got it to the extent necessary for this particular level, for this particular task. I think that's all we can do.
Again, I think that's another important tip, isn't it, that we would often espouse, that learning outcomes don't use the word understand in them. How important is it for learners to assess each other as well as assess themselves in terms of learning effectively, Phil?
I think both are really, really important. We want them to assess themselves. Self-assessment is really, really valuable. But the best way into self-assessment is peer assessment, assessing other people's work, assessing other people's mistakes, assessing other people's triumphs and this sort of thing. And I think we forget that students, when they share work and look at each other's work, they make their own work a lot better by looking at what other people have done, the way other people have succeeded. And they also avoid the mistakes that other people have made. And I think getting them to peer assess, not formally peer assess with the numbers taken down and used in evidence against them, but to do this all the time as part of their natural way of working. I think this is enormously helpful. Because in a way, learning, I think, always should be practice for delivering the assessment. I would say that right with the learning outcomes, as I said before, if you can do all the outcomes, you've got nothing at all to worry about. If you get them to actually just see how much they can do, but particularly see which bits you can't do. And I should suggest to students with ordinary notes and handouts, actually put a symbol beside the thing you haven't yet cracked. So you can look back and think, I'll have another go at it. Because it's a bit like a crossword. I do a crossword and I I can't think of. I come back half an hour later. Oh, I know that is. And, the mind works on things that are unfinished business.
I want to return to a point you just made, actually, about understanding. When you said, you only started to understand thermodynamics when you started teaching it. And I want to talk about teaching. So I've often found that the best way to learn about topics is to teach them to other people. So whenever I've been asked to teach a topic that I'm unfamiliar with, I've actually learned more about that topic by planning and doing teaching sessions on it than I have in other ways. How important is it to get learners teaching each other, and will learners teaching each other help them to learn more effectively?
The short answer is definitely, absolutely, certainly. I think it's about the power of using what I now call verbalizing, actually saying something to somebody else. It gets it deeper into a head than just reading it. You can read something and actually not understand it at all, but you can try to explain it to somebody else. And they think, now I know a bit more about what it means. I think if we can get them teaching each other, it really helps. But getting them making a little podcast and audio or something, recording of what they think something means, is still good practice because they're verbalizing it, they're putting it into words, they're expressing it. That's a lot faster than writing it all down. And of course, the tone of voice, the expression, the pauses, the hesitancies, they're aware of every little bit of that when they're doing it or face-to-face or audio. Whereas in writing, you don't know. Somebody might have sit and spend 20 minutes composing half a paragraph. We don't know the speed at which something was written. Does that answer part of that question?
Absolutely, and it leads in really nicely to my final question, actually, Phil. So, on many occasions when I've set exams, for example, for my learners, I've waited nervously for them to emerge from the examination hall, ready to ask them how it went. And many of them have said to me, I could have explained myself better if I could tell you what I know rather than have to write it down. So, why is that verbalizing learning so powerful? And why do we use it enough actually as an assessment strategy in higher education?
We don't use it nearly enough. I think if I was in charge of education, I'd say that no more than 15% could be assessed by written exam. Because some things lend themselves to being assessed by written exam, but many, many other things don't. Because, as I said, my handwriting is terrible. So, if you've got bad writing, that's going to interfere with the assessment. Nobody would read my writing happily, as it were. They wouldn't get what I meant quite often. And a lot of people have really slow writing. I haven't got fast, untidy writing. A lot of people write really slowly, but think really quickly. Writing just doesn't match the thought of the brain process. And question and answer really does much better. And people can very often explain something far better than people write it in all sorts of ways. This is why talking to each other as students is so useful rather than just sitting on their own, because they're hearing different speeds, they're hearing different ways of thinking. And I would like there to be assessment that included all the normal ways of communicating. Written for a little bit, certainly visual, but getting them to make decisions on something on paper, which is possible to do without actually writing other than yes, no, or whatever. But the act of just reproduction of a fact or a theory or an idea is so useless in a way. It won't stay with them any longer anyway. I think we should measure in other ways. Now, people say that exams are fair, and I don't think they are. They're equally unfair to all sorts of people. I've written a lot about the problems with exams, and I think handwriting is one problem, but the occasion of sitting silently at a desk in a threatening room that is intimidating, with the squeak of the invigilator's shoes going past and this sort of thing. The tension in an exam is enormous. One thing I used to do when I was invigilating the exam, I would find a brick from somewhere, and I would stand on the stage of the hall or something like that, and I take the brick in my hand, and I just absolutely silently raise it above my head, as if I was going to throw it. And those students who noticed would burst into a grin. You'd relieve the tension and this sort of thing. They thought, this is just bizarre that somebody can be standing with a brick in the air and this sort of thing. And the more you can make it more humane for people, the better they'll do. And if they just had a smile, they'll write better, they'll think better, and whatever else. Whereas otherwise, they'd be sweating, thinking, is my mind working, is my pen working, all that sort of thing. I think exams are quite inhuman. And we've had a history of ministers of education, Gavin Williamson in particular, who's Sir Gavin Williamson, as he now is, exams are the only fair way to measure. And Boris Johnson's repeated this and this sort of thing. It's absolute rubbish. It's fair in only the respect that they're all being measured in the same way at the same time in the same place on the same day. However, they have to be feeling, whether they've got hay fever or something else, whether it's the difficult time of day for them, etc. It's not fair at all on all the other grounds. So I would limit the amount of written assessment of that.
I think that's a fantastic note on which to finish, Phil, because I couldn't agree more. I've often found that written assessments for many students pose a number of barriers, particularly written exams. Not only do they have to, they're being assessed on their handwriting effectively, aren't they? They're being assessed on their management of time, their ability to recall information. And if that's not the intention of the assessment, then it's by design going to pose barriers to many learners, isn't it? And that's not necessarily the right way to do things. So I'm certainly with you on that one.
I also think if you look at what exams do measure and express that as a learning outcome, to write neatly, to write quickly, to write on time, to keep to time, to all those sorts of things, to have equal time for equal marks opportunity, those are the actual learning outcomes of exams. And where does one ever see them written down? I think if we're preparing them for exams, we should turn these into learning outcomes and put our hearts where our mouth is, as it were. And I think if we did that, we wouldn't use them as much. Now, of course, the danger with other forms of assessment is there's unwanted corporate collaboration, that sort of thing goes on, contract cheating, all the other sorts of things. But in a way, that is less serious in terms of learning than many other things are. Someone who concocts an answer or makes up an answer and looks at the web and puts together an answer is actually doing quite a lot of thinking anyway. They're learning the ropes of that particular subject. And I think we have to recognize that students are very skillful at using their intelligence to tackle whatever situation they find themselves in, and long may it continue. In fact, just to add one thing at the end, going back to one of your earlier questions.
Oh, go on.
Getting them to assess is really useful. And what I've sometimes found it useful to do is if there's a fairly big group of people and they're going to have, say, a written piece of work to hand in at the end, maybe 3 or 4 pages, I put quite a few copies of past assignments in the room. And I put the students into groups and saying, look at these and rate them, see what the best one. Well, try and find the best one in the room eventually, because I'm trying to find the best one and the worst one, but it doesn't matter about the worst one. Try and find the best one. And when students are looking with an assessment mind, what does this really mean? How does this work? What is the, especially if the typewritten as well, rather than the handwritten, like mine. And students are really good in a group at working out which the best ones are. Individually, less good. But in the group, they're discussing, but this is how this is mentioned here, this is mentioned there, that sort of thing. You get that discussion. And the learning in that discussion is worth 10 out of me talking. They learn so much just by making that decision. And they're very good at finding the best one. And Roy Sadler in Australia, who's one of my gurus, as it were, he always used to put his own assignment into the mix. And it would never win. And the students could see, I can do better than Roy Sadler did. And, that really cheered them up enormously. And he wasn't playing, he was having a good go. Mm. But the students have to work out what the quality means for real in what they produce. Sorry to add that tangent.
No, I think that's a fantastic way to finish, Phil, because it was a great insight, and it's something I think that certainly I've tried to espouse with trainee teachers about getting students to look at work and decide for themselves which one is the best one, what good looks like, because obviously, like you say, it's important to have that assessment mindset, isn't it? Phil, again, thanks so much for joining us. It's been an absolutely fascinating sort of half an hour or so. Thanks again, Phil.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for the lovely question.